Hello and very good afternoon to all of you. This is Avinash Sharma, Director ASSOCHAM, and I welcome all of you at this webinar on navigating FTAs and trade remedies to your advantage in India, which is being jointly organized by ASSOCHAM and Khitan and Company. Today we are going to cover very important topics, including emerging trends in customs and international trade, India's recent FTAs, identifying opportunity for your advantage, understanding rules of origin from exporters' perspective, Karuta, compliance by Indian importers, emerging trends in trade remedies and bilateral issues, viewing FTAs from trade remedies lens, importance of monitoring for dumping, non-tariff barrier enforcement and protection. So to cover this important topic, we have very eminent experts here with us. We have Mr. Udyan Choksi, partner Khitan and Company, and Mr. Vikram Naik, principal associate Khitan and Company, who will be joining once Mr. Udyan Choksi is done with his PPT. So I would like to read a very brief profile of both the experts. Mr. Udyan Choksi is a partner in Khitan and Company's indirect tax, customs and international trade practice. He has been working in indirect taxes for 20 plus years, serving multinational operations in India's largest business. Udyan advises on all indirect taxes, including GST, pre-GST taxes, customs, foreign trade policy, and trade remedial measures. His work has included GST transition, tax advisory, customs, SVB representation, and advising and assisting client in investigation by the tax authorities. His area of focus is tax optimized supply chain nationally and internationally, including valuation aspect across direct and indirect tax regulations and trade remedies. He has also advises clients on tax optimization opportunities. He has been recognized as highly regarded in indirect taxes by World Tax and has been consistently recognized by as an indirect tax leader for India by International Tax Review since 2015. Our next speaker will be Mr. Vikram Naik, Principal Associate Khitan and Company. He's a Principal Associate in the Indirect Tax Practice Group with a special focus in customs and international trade practices in the Mumbai office. He specializes in WTO matters, FTA and trade remedies, customs cases, litigation, and supply chain advisory matters, including the preferential trade under FTAs, trade compliance, export control, and sanctions. So before I invite Mr. Udyan Choksi, I would like to request all the participants to keep posting your question and answers in the Q&A box, which would be answered by our expert after the presentation. So with this word, I would like to invite Mr. Udyan Choksi to share his important views with the participants. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Avinash. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session this afternoon. Vikram and I, over the next hour and a bit, will talk you through some recent developments on India's FTAs. I'll talk to you about the context of these FTAs and how these FTAs actually impact you, your clients, yourselves. And Vikram will then get into some of the trade remedy aspects and the wider WTO aspects of what we're going to cover. As Avinash just read out, we've broken up today's agenda into 8 subtopics, starting with some thoughts on the emerging trends where India is placed today in this dynamic marketplace, made even more dynamic by the other happenings in Europe, the constant squabbles with our neighbors, and how that impacts our trade. We'll then talk a little bit about Karuta, our origin rules which came in 2020, how those have been playing out. And then I'll hand it over to Vikram to talk to you about how all of these FTAs can be looked at or are best looked at from a trade remedies lens, and how you have in some instances the trade remedy forces giving you tailwinds in terms of FTA treatment, and in some cases while these two might move in opposite directions. Now, from a citizen point of view, in terms of what India has been up to, I think FTAs came into the limelight in late 2020 and through last year when we took a decision to step out of RCEP, which would have been and still is in numerical terms the largest FTA of its kind, 30% of world GDP and 30% of the world's population covered by the entities, the countries that are part of RCEP. That's the 10 countries of ASEAN, and then its FTA partners in the region, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, and of course China. And we decided in 2020 that we'd step out of it, partly because of the political and sort of socio-economic aspects of it, and partly because from a purely trade standpoint, there was this risk of what exposure of our markets to China would actually bring. coupled with the fact that perhaps we weren't getting as much mileage as we wanted in terms of opening up, giving ourselves market access on the services side. And what we have seen, therefore, as a result of that, has been this increasing move by us as a country to move towards bilateral or plurilateral arrangements. Now, this is something we are seeing in a larger WTO context as well, for a variety of reasons, and Vikram will touch upon some of those. There have been deadlocks in terms of the WTO mechanism overall, and we are therefore seeing many countries moving into plurilateral or bilateral arrangements in terms of getting their trade organized in the best way possible. So if you see the journey of our FTAs, we started with Korea and Japan some years back. Most recently, we've concluded 2 treaties earlier this year, which was with UAE and Australia. The UAE treaty is out, but still to be codified in terms of the customs notification. Those are still to come through, but we have the text of the SIPA, and that's something we'll be discussing in little detail this afternoon. And we've already had announcements of additional FTAs that we are likely to sign later this year, which is with the GCC and then the long pending FTA with the EU and of course with the UK now, the UK having stepped out of the EU post-Brexit. The second is that in this FTA context, this huge issue of what origin means and the fact that worldwide there has been this move towards tightening how origin gets captured, gets measured, gets documented, gets proven, because there is this threat, this constant threat of goods being diverted and therefore abuse in that sense of an FTA provision. And not only does that sort of mean that trade diversion takes place, but at a bilateral country level, it actually means that the treaty benefits that the countries have so carefully tried to put together are actually getting destroyed. This is all happening in the context of course, the move that we made to faceless assessment. We now have these 11 specialized commissionerates across the country. The customs tariff split amongst them, expert commissionerates in terms of the chapters that they look over. And therefore, faster, more streamlined, and in several cases, smoother. Of course, there might be case-to-case instances where this faceless has created a bit of a problem sometimes, given that you don't have ready access to go and meet the officer who's clearing your bit of entry. But overall, the trend seems to be that this move to faceless, at least on the customs side, has been quite positive. Linked to that, we have the AEO, which was introduced a couple of years back. That again fits into the larger international scheme of how supply chains are being managed and the simplifications that the AEO offers. And several people have now taken that step towards taking a T2, a tier 2 classification under AEO for the benefits that it brings. Those benefits become even more important in the current economic climate that we live in, indirect tax benefit wise, which is that we've had over the last few years, substantial curtailment in terms of our export oriented benefits. So we've seen a whittling down of the benefits under the FTP, your scripts, the duty credit scripts that we were getting under the reward schemes disappearing. We had ROTTEP come in, but of course, most industries, I would say all industries, have the issue in terms of how much ROTTEP has actually replaced the benefits that were available earlier. And really what we are seeing is a move towards supporting Indian industry. I think that seems to be probably in some ways unsaid, but I think the direction in which the government seems to be approaching this, supporting our Indian industry, is to look more at facilitating exports rather than actually giving SOPs for exports. So we have these treaties being signed, opening up of our markets, and really, I think the push towards asking Indian industry to become more competitive and take leverage of this access which has been provided, rather than asking for those SOPs. Now, industry to industry or company to company, this is going to work for some and not work as well for the others. But clearly, this is the direction in which the government has taken, oriented itself. So that sort of sets the stage for where we are at, which is we are signing FTAs to deepen market access and to diversify how supply chains need to be set up. And if you were to take a few examples, you would be aware of the Japanese companies, for example, who set up textile facilities in Bangladesh under arrangements that they have there, and the consequent effects that follows from the manufacture happening in Bangladesh, because then we have treaties with Bangladesh as being their neighbor. So when one looks at how these bilateral or plurilateral FTAs operate in a larger worldwide context, it's a real opportunity to perhaps look at what supply chain diversification opportunities arise. And really what we read in the news about whether it's manufacture of semiconductors, which of course has made the news since COVID happened, but across different products of key economic significance, really this emerging FTA sort of spread that India has now got into really presents an opportunity. We will of course have the attendant direct tax and transfer pricing aspects to contend with as these diversifications happen. But as you will see in the course of what Vikram and I share with you today, there really is an opportunity for Indian business to rethink how they look at playing on the world stage. Now, a question which often arises is that what is the enabling provision which allows India to enter into these FTAs, and isn't there an MFN requirement under our obligations to the WTO? And really, just to clarify, that there is that derogation which is enabled by Article 24, which says that RTAs can be signed. There are, of course, conditions under which that happens, and therefore this the sheer number, not only India, but all of the treaties that you've seen, whether it's the US, whether it's within Europe, have all been pursuant to this derogation which Article 24 allows. Now, there are different types of agreements that we've signed, and if you all have seen the customs notifications which have been issued previously, so whether it's ASEAN or our neighboring countries, all of those have actually been pursuant to different types of FTAs that we've signed. I've just put up for you the evolution of how agreements can be, and the fact that we are now moving towards a SIPA-oriented world. So while India originally had more preferential trade agreements, which only talk about products, specific, a limited list, a positive list, if you will, of items which get exempted, we then move to FTAs, which are more sort of negative list based, saying everything's exempted or everything's reduced rate, barring what's disallowed, to moving to comprehensive economic cooperation agreements where you have beyond just tariff reduction, but a more comprehensive sort of economic coverage, and finally SIPAs, where trade in a larger context, services and investment and other areas of economic partnership are also being discussed. So I'm going to center the rest of my sort of piece with you this afternoon on the text of the key elements, section 2 and 3 of our text with the UAE treaty. As I said, the Australia treaty, the text of the treaty is still to become public. Just to give you a sense of how expensive the SIPA is, and which is to sort of emphasize the point, and Vikram will talk to you more about this, that SIPAs go beyond just customs duty reductions. These 18 chapters over, I think, 828 pages is the coverage of what the India-UAE SIPA has. So I'll just run through some of these. I'll be focusing on chapters 2 and 3 of these, and Vikram will take you through some of the other chapters or the provisions under some of these other chapters which are relevant to sort of the trade remedies aspect of it. Just some highlight numbers in terms of this treaty, given that we are awaiting the notification. We have the text of the treaty, but we don't have the notification just yet. It's expected to be notified pretty soon because both countries, I think India has ratified it, and we're waiting for ratification by the UAE, following which there will be sort of sharing of the update that there has been this ratification, and 60 days thereafter, the SIPA goes live, which means we'll see the customs notifications come through at that time. And that was expected to happen around May or June this year. Now, this treaty is going to reduce to zero duty, the UAE for 90% of India's exports. So that's in terms of value. On the other hand, what India is going to give access to the UAE is to bring down 65% of the tariff lines, which goes up to 90% of the tariff lines over a 10-year period. So there are staggered benefits that will roll out over this period. It's a sort of 10-year horizon that the SIPA covers. Importantly, there's a specific relaxation that we've made for a tariff quota for 200 tons of gold. As people know, gold coming in from the Middle East, from Dubai, especially, has been a key point for customs for a long time. The SIPA also covers some specific provisions for items such as market access on the pharma side, and there are certain other sort of industry-specific benefits which are also there. I just, like I said, want to mention this to you because this is really a situation of going beyond just a customs duty exemption. So there is, for the first time, I think in one of our SIPAs, mention of digital trade, government procurement, of course, which is a WTO obligation, but specific rules under that, specific provisions for SMEs. And as you will see, and I touched upon Karuta before, certain relaxations from the Karuta provisions as well. So with that, let me dive into, like I said, chapter 2 and 3 of the SIPA. I just want to mention, I'll focus on chapter 3 because origin is really what the game is all about. This is all very good. It's more of a policy document, but until it translates into a customs rate reduction notification and until we have the mechanism to actually bring that home, that's going to remain a wish list. So let me start by going into what the coverage of the SIPA is on the goods side. Again, this is the chapter 2 of the 18 chapters that you just saw. So Article 2.1 says that the scope and coverage is all goods that are traded. There's no exclusion for any goods. But the treatment for each of those goods will then follow from the annex in terms of where the relaxations of customs duty have been prescribed. Important to clarify that Article 2.2 provides that for the purposes of the SIPA, customs duty excludes internal taxes that we charge in India, additional duty, ADD and CVD, and other local taxes. Now, you will see the spirit of cooperation and trade enablement in terms of how some of these clauses are playing out. So 2.4 talks about a specific commitment not to nullify or impair concessions except under the provisions of the SIPA. So what we're saying is we've come together to do this, and there's an extensive preamble and a very interesting preamble. It talks about both countries' WTO obligations, both countries' wish list and vision to form a free trade agreement or free trade corridor between the Middle East and India, and saying that they want to do everything to actually increase the free flow of goods and services. So therefore 2.4 and this commitment to say that no action will be taken which actually provides a backdoor entry to either country to nullify or impair any of the concessions that are intended under the FTA. It also specifically provides that if there's an MFN rate which reduces below the SIPA rate, then of course that lower rate benefit will also be available even under the SIPA. Clarification of certain points which one of course knows from a WTO context, but specific mention has been made of that, which is under 2.5, which is that classifications as per the HSN. So that's important from a standardization standpoint. I think several companies would have seen that for those customs unions, and probably Europe's a good example, and I think the US as well for certain chapters, where when you don't have alignment of how the tariff looks, you can perhaps sometimes have a mismatch and therefore misclassification in terms of what the exporter classifies the exported goods as and what the importer classifies them as, and then that you can get into hot water with the customs department. So 2.5 here says that classification will be as per the HSN. 2.11 says that valuation will be as per Article 7 of the GATT. That's our 2007 customs valuation rule, which is also really an embodiment of the same agreement pursuant to Article 7. There's a commitment, this is important, there's a commitment not to introduce or maintain export subsidies contrary to the WTO. Now, as you know, several of our FTP schemes have had issues with that. Several countries, Brazil, the US, Australia, all making complaints against us. And this commitment actually just underlines that spirit that India, because we've done it before, I think UAE doesn't have too many of those subsidies, but not to introduce them contrary to the WTO. And finally, that no non-tariff measures, and Vikram will talk to you a little more about those, no non-tariff measures to be applied beyond what the WTO or the SIPA actually covers. So that's how they've set out the four corners as such in terms of how trade is supposed to happen under the SIPA. With that, let's go to the rules of origin. So we now know that both countries have liberalized, as I said, 90% of value in our case, 65 going up to 90% of line items in their case, markets to each other, and some key definitions which come under rules of origin. So we're now saying that as far as this trade in goods is concerned, these are the rules of origin that need to be factored into to actually enable this concessional rates of duty. So we start by, I won't go through all of them for paucity of time, but I'll just focus on some of the key ones. This concept of indirect material, which is material which is used in production, testing, etc., which doesn't form part of the product, but which is part of the cost of manufacture of that product. There's a specific treatment to be accorded to indirect material, and we'll come to that when we reach that article. And then these three words that you see at the bottom of your screen, manufacture, product, and production. And you'll see the mirroring of the language, the words that have been used there. So manufacture refers to working, processing, or specific operations, not including simple assembly. And you will now see a picture starting to emerge in terms of what you can and can't do to be taking advantage of the SIPA. So, you know, when I put this back into the context that I started off with, to say that this is an opportunity to look at supply chains and see how supply chains can be built around these trade enabling treaties that we've signed. All of these are terms which are going to become relevant, because when you know, manufacturing gets set up or done in different parts, and Vikram will talk to you about one of the examples. In fact, we are assisting a client in a trade matter on something similar, where there is part production happening in China, the goods come back to India, and then they get re-exported. And there have been issues both in terms of, you know, anti-dumping as well as in terms of treatment under the free trade agreements. So, like I said, these terms are important in terms of saying what is it that we are enabling the custom reduction for. So it's goods manufactured, and manufactured doesn't mean just simple assembly. And then product of a country, which links to production, the next word you see there, is that it covers growing, raising, mining, harvesting, fishing, aquaculture, trapping, etc. So each of the different elements in terms of, as we go through the chapters of the tariff, the different manner in which goods would arise, each of those has been captured in terms of saying that that is how product, and therefore that is how production gets defined for the purposes of the SIPA. So we have these two key concepts saying that to qualify for the FTA benefit, you must be having originating material, which means you qualify as originating as defined under the chapter 3. And conversely, if you have non-originating material, which means material which is bought outside of India and the UAE, then you will have to perhaps satisfy some additional tests to make sure that the goods that you're importing, which include non-originating material, still qualify for the duty benefit. Now, this is, so there's two key definitions. One is wholly manufactured material, wholly originating material, and non-wholly originating material. The first bullet you see on top is when a product is deemed to be wholly originating and therefore triggering the preferential treatment. And again, we go through those same different subparts of what production and produce is. So you have plants and animals, products from them, items, you know, minerals which are mined, hunting, fishing, and then of course manufacturing activity. So that's as far as wholly originating goods are concerned. Obviously, the larger sort of interest and the larger gamut is in terms of not wholly originating. And there you have this concept of the product specific rules, the PSR. Now, we have Annex 3B in the SIPA, which talks about at a line item level, what is it that the exporting country needs to satisfy to fulfill the requirements of PSR to actually qualify for the lower rate of customs duty. So there's two, we'll come to the concepts in greater detail, but the first key concept to mention here is this concept of value addition. And there are two ways to calculate value addition. You either start with the FOB or ex works price and subtract the value of non-originating material and take that ratio, or you work yourself up from cost to say cost of material, labor and overhead, pretty much prepare a cost sheet. And again, that fraction over the FOB value of your ex works price tells you what the value addition in that country is. So like I said, either you back work from ex works or you work yourself up through the cost sheet. We then talked about indirect materials, and we said that that those were the ones which were used in the manufacture but not forming part of the goods. And the treaty provides that indirect materials are neither considered originating nor non-originating, and therefore get excluded for calculation purposes. We then come to some other key elements in terms of how one is to look at the origin concept. So the next key concept is de minimis, which is to say that when there is my apologies, I don't know how visible this might be to you on a smaller screen, but I think we're going to be sharing the presentation, so you will have the text of it with you. So the concept of de minimis is that if there's a small amount of non-originating material and that does not meet the change in tariff classification requirement. So as I said, we'll come back to what the different requirements are, but maybe I can pause here for a minute, even before we go to it, and say that under Annex 3B, which I referred to, you have to satisfy a value addition criterion, and the value addition criterion is 40% of value addition per what we just described. In addition, there could be, and in most cases there is, additional conditions in terms of saying that there must be a change in tariff classification. Now that could be at the chapter level, it could be at the heading level, or it could be at the subheading level. So what de minimis in that context is saying is that if non-originating materials do not meet the required change in terms of CTC, it's still all right if the total value of those non-originating materials doesn't exceed 10% of the FOB value. And there's a special additional condition or enablement for fabrics, which says that in addition to the 10% test, if the weight of the fabric is only 7% of the total weight of materials, then again, non-origination can be excluded. Then we have the list of items, and again, going back to my point about supply chain design, that a product shall not be considered originating in a party meaning one of the two countries, by merely undergoing any of the following operations. So these are what one might call the sort of simpliciter operations where you might do an artificial value add, but not actual manufacture or production. And the treaty seeks to deny you benefits in those cases where it's a sort of very superficial value addition that is being carried out. So for example, things like washing, cleaning that you see at item C, or painting and polishing, simple assembly, things like that. They've even gone so far as to define the word simple, which is to say an activity which neither requires special skills nor machinery apparatus. That is what qualifies as simple activities, which doesn't qualify itself for this qualifying criterion of origin. Furthermore, Article 3.6 in the same sort of spirit of things says mere dilution to create one substance into another does not qualify to make an originating product. And likewise, the production or pricing practice, if one finds that the object was only to circumvent the provisions of the chapter, then again, that would not be something which would qualify. Two then specific provisions in terms of packing, and we'll see some touch points in terms of our customs valuation rules or our customs provisions also in terms of exemptions that have been allowed. So what Articles 3.8 and 3.9 do is talk about what is the value takeaway in terms of packages and packing materials when these are used to pack the goods that are qualifying as under the origination criterion. So what it says is that these packages will be, if these packages are classified, and we go back to our rules on classification in the customs tariff, which says that if the packing is classified with the goods in question, then those are to be disregarded for CTC purposes. However, from a value standpoint, their value to make sure the origination 40% is met or otherwise, that value is to be considered. Likewise, if there are accessories, spare parts and tools which are being bought from a third-party country outside of the UAE and India, again, so long as those are not separately invoiced for and their supply is customary along with the product, they again get excluded for well, rather they don't automatically get disqualified for origination criteria, but again will get counted separately from a value criteria. Then Articles 3.12 and 3.15 talk about certain elements around the transport of the goods. Now, this is important. What we've talked about so far is how the goods need to be manufactured, what processes we will accept, what processes we will reject, the treatment of packing materials, we now come to how the goods are going to be moved and how the goods are going to be invoiced for. So Article 3.12 says that the preferential treatment shall only be granted if there is direct movement between the two parties, so goods moving between the UAE and India, and typically there will be a disallowance from the customs reduction benefit if the goods are routed through a different country. Only two exceptions have been made for that, which is that if it's only routed perhaps for transport convenience purposes and they remain under customs control when they move to a non-party country, and also if there's no operation which is carried out on those goods, then in those situations, the fact that the transport has not been direct will not vitiate eligibility for the SIPA benefit. The importer is of course required to maintain evidence of this. Third-party invoicing, that's a situation where there's a specific mention in the FTA to say that the automatic fact that you've, in a sense, what we call merchant trade merchant trader in our FTPs, similar situations there, that the simpliciter fact of A manufacturer selling to B seller to export the goods to India or the other way around to the UAE will not in itself qualify or rather cause a disqualification from the origination standpoint. With that, we then come to some of the obligations. So that's really as far as the treaty talks about how the transport needs to be done. We now come to the stickier parts in terms of what the obligation of the exporter and the importer is in terms of what they need to be doing. So Article 3.11 talks about accounting segregation. It says that as a best practice or as a sort of first option, it's incumbent upon the exporter to actually physically segregate the goods that are being used for export, under the SIPA. There's a second option to go under one of the approved accounting methods. And again, certain requirements, I won't go into the detail of that because I want to cover more ground on the Karuta and how some of these provisions have been replicated in our provisions as well. We then come to the responsibility of the exporter to, regarding proof of origin. And this is really where we now see a lot of these provisions mirroring in terms of what we've already imposed in India from 2020. So Article 3.13 says that for products originating in either party, the proof of origin has to be provided through a certificate of origin. While here you have C saying that an approved exporter can also make the declaration. In fact, there's another article, Article 35, which says that that's on a best efforts basis and that will happen when it does. But for now, it's only the authorized, the sort of ministry representatives in either country, which qualifies to actually provide a certificate of origin. And that's something which needs to be kept. And we'll come to the additional obligations that exist in that regard. That's what we see on your screen now, Article 3.14. So there's a prescribed format in terms of what the certificate of origin needs to look like. It needs to have a unique number. It needs to be issued and authenticated by the competent authority in each state. There's an issue with dating, the fact that you can't make erasures or superimpositions. The fact that there's a time limit in terms of when the CO needs to be procured. There are, of course, certain relaxations available there, but again, each of those are going to become, in our experience, cases where these get investigated. We were, again, part of another dispute between two parties where the ASEAN treaty was being used, and because it was a retrospectively issued CO, customs in India raised questions about it, and it then got into a larger investigation in terms of how origin criteria had been met. So we have all of these requirements under Article 3.14 in terms of what the exporter needs to do. 3.17 provides a detailed process in terms of what data needs to be provided, the format in which the application needs to be made, what details the format needs to cover, and so on. Coming then to the obligations on the importer, that's in Article 20, which is presentation of the CO once the goods land in India. Now we have the importer or its authorized representative, the CHA, needs to submit to customs at the time that the import takes place itself, the original copy of the CO. So you now see all of these requirements, and I'll maybe talk about this in a little more detail, time permitting later, but the fact that this onus and responsibility and complexity has of late increased for Indian importers, and what impact that has had for usage of FTAs and RTAs. And I believe there are some statistics to show that this additional responsibility has actually deterred some importers from actually invoking the benefits of those, which of course means you're creating a trade distortion because of a procedural complexity, and that's something which I'll talk about in some more detail later. Now, there is a detailed process of verification which is enabled, articles 3.21, 3.22 and so on. All of those deal with situations where if at the destination country, the customs authority there or the trade authority there is of the view that there is something amiss in terms of the customs benefit that is being claimed, then at the first instance to seek verification from the importer, but beyond that to actually go to the exporting country, not only to write to the authority of the exporting country, but beyond that to actually go and make a visit. Well, first reach out to the authority in the exporting country, then seek information from them, and then, like happens in AD/CVD investigations, to actually, if it comes to that, go and make a visit to that country to actually verify what has been certified in the CEO. So the point I want to drive at with this is, while this is of course the text of the treaty, and as importers or exporters, we would ultimately be looking at the wordings of the notification. But to the extent that the wordings of our notification or Karuta, and I'll come to Karuta in a minute, are more stringent than these provisions, I wanted to point out that both the text of the treaty as well as the text of Karuta provides that the treaty will override, and therefore there is this enablement beyond the strict confines of what Karuta allows for. So continuing in the same spirit, there is special provisions for release of the goods, for confidentiality to be maintained, when denial of preferential treatment can happen. So that's for the customs at the destination country to decide that the products don't meet the requirements of rule of origin, or the documentation is insufficient or hasn't been provided. And like I said, that triggers the outreach to the other country to make sure that the provisions are being met. Now I'll pause here for a minute to say that when I reflected upon the Article 2 and Article 3 that I just took you through, what would be the takeaways for Indian businesses or indeed UAE businesses from this? And for Indian businesses, not just in the UAE context, because I don't want to make this session too UAE specific. I just thought it was most relevant to go into a deeper dive of it because of how contemporary it is, and therefore more detailed, and it also points to the direction in which we're going as a country. But really, I think, given that, as I said, we have a GCC agreement to be signed, Australia, the text to come through, and then Europe and the UK thereafter, what is the opportunity that these sort of treaties present to businesses to sort of operate? And I think I'd break that up into perhaps 4 different elements. One is coverage, making sure that your goods, and I'm now talking about goods, Vikram will take you through the wider ramifications of services and the other trade aspects of it. But sticking to goods for a minute, what is the coverage of goods that you have, where is the market? So let's take UK as an example. Suppose you're looking to export goods to the UK or Europe. One needs to look at what's the size of the market there. Is there demand for those goods? What's the best way to set up a supply chain? Are there treaties already existing with those countries where you might have a sort of intermediary location that you use somewhere? Is there a competitive advantage that you have in India? And it's ultimately this sort of data which needs to be presented to the ministry when they are negotiating these deals, because as you will see when you go through the text of the SIPA, each of those has a line item specification in terms of how much relaxation and at what point in time relaxation is to be given. And really they'll be able to make those representations for you as a exporter on behalf, as being the country, only when that data is available. So actually the best time, I think almost like investing on a lighter note, I think what do they say? The best time to invest was yesterday and the second best is now. I think it's something similar with the FTAs. The best time to involve yourself in FTA negotiation was, before it got signed. Now it's the time is to best ride the wave that the FTA opportunity creates. So like I said, what's the opportunity? One is consider coverage. Second is the product specific rules that we looked at. The experience of, let's say, the UAE FTA, for example, are we happy with how that PSR is set up, or would one like to recommend or suggest or push for changes from it? Second or third, in terms of process, is the process that the FTA, all of the clauses that I just took you through in terms of chapters 2 and 3, are those processes that we are happy with, or should we be looking at changes in terms of process? And last is in terms of obligations, that the obligations that we are taking on as manufacturers or as exporters, are they something which we are happy with? And how we design our supply chain really has to be looked at in that larger context. And Vikram and I were just discussing this, and I think he came up with this phrase saying, should we look at these FTAs from an enabling perspective or a defensive perspective? And I think typically several countries have had that defensive sort of approach, saying that the minute I agree to sign an FTA, I'm opening up my market and it's going to hurt a segment of my domestic industry, even though it might reduce price and create demand. Of course, that has its implications on forex and balance of payments also. But rather, therefore, not look at this, defensive piece of it, but say that is there something from an enabling sort of growth strategy perspective that one can look at in terms of doing this. And therefore, going back to the point I made about having the data, seeing the trends, seeing the manner in which things are moving. So, for example, if there's a move away from a Russia or there's a move away from a China for geopolitical or other reasons, then do those present opportunities either for direct exports from India or, like I said, to set up optimal supply chains with friendly countries with whom we have those sort of relations, or we are looking to have those sort of relations. So the flip side of what you just saw in terms of the restrictive parts of the FTP, of the FTA, is the Karuta provisions. Now, the Karuta provisions came through, as you know, in 2020. They were notified by the department, by the government. They are, in a sense, a unilateral document that we've come up with, and in some ways dilute the benefits that our FTAs and RTAs allow. Like I said, I think the key element of them being unilateral has been a factor which has not gone well with all of our trading partners. I know there's one specific instance of Japan where they said that this actually dilutes what is supposed to be enabled by the FTA. So that the point I made earlier about this backdoor entry and no artificial impediment to be created, and Karuta to some extent has been sort of seen as that. The second key takeaway from Karuta is that really from an international perspective, what it has done is taken the responsibility away from the exporting country's authority and put it on the importer. And some might say that that's a little bit of an unfair burden that you're putting on the importer. And when we go to the rules of what Karuta asks the importer to maintain and keep, and even find out, you'll actually find that it is really quite onerous. So with that, let's just go to the key elements of what the Karuta has. It came in, as you know, in September 2020, and increasingly we're now seeing investigations around Karuta. As I told you, we've been part of a few. Indian Customs is certainly looking at CEOs in quite a lot of detail. It's reaching out to each of these importers who are using these CEOs. You know that they have access to all imports chapter-wise through the NIDB. And therefore, really anything which smacks of a movement in terms of price or volume, again, Vikram can talk to you about how volumes have increased where these treaties have been misused or abused. But really what customs has been going after is to see that, is the importer discharging his burden in terms of saying that this is a duty benefit that I want to take. And as I said, this has been the cause for some statistics that there has been a move away from using some of our FTA, RTA benefits. So you will see a lot of mirroring of the language in the SIPA that I took you through. And I actually just put it back on the slides here to actually bring out that there is distinct similarity there. But again, to also emphasize the point that wherever there is dissimilarity, it's the treaty which is going to override the provisions of Karuta. That will, of course, potentially have to be litigated because the department may not readily actually agree or apply the provisions of the treaty over Karuta, but that is something you can, you can certainly explore, and we'll be happy to discuss in more detail with you. So there are just 6 or 7 rules under Karuta. Rule 3 talks about what the importer needs to do. To claim a preferential rate of duty at the time of filing the bill of entry, a declaration needs to be made that the goods originated from a treaty country. The CEO needs to be provided, and certain details also need to be mentioned on the bill of entry itself. A lot of origin data, and that's what you see in Rule 4, needs to be maintained. And there's a Form 1 which actually talks about what that data is that the importer needs to maintain. Now, that actually, if you see the form, also talks about not only the manner in which the origin criteria is met, but it also asks what's the process of manufacture. And it also asks if all the goods which went into the goods which are exported were made by the exporter, or some of them have been bought out. And you get a sense from that in terms of what are you really asking the importer to do, and how really feasible is it for him. Now, for a large importer, perhaps he has that access to his vendor, or it might be a related party transaction where some of this data is available, subject to confidentiality. But really for this trading community, for commodity items, where the bulk of this use of FTAs and RTAs actually happens, there is this arguably very onerous burden which has been put on this importer to sort of clarify or have access to this information about where it's manufactured, who's manufactured it, and how, under which criterion under the relevant FTA the RBC condition is met. That document needs to be kept for 5 years, again ensuring accuracy and reasonableness of the information is on the importer to do. Now, what happens if customs suspects or has reason to believe that there is some wrongful use of the benefit of the CEO? At the first instance, under Rule 5, they will go back to the importer and seek information from him. He is then, there are timelines which are provided in the rules to say he needs to come back with that information. And only if that information satisfies customs that the goods are fairly coming through will the benefit of the low rate be given. What has practically Rule 5 done? I think there have been several instances where, while this investigation goes through, the goods remain in customs custody, the containers are lying sort of at the port, demurrage is being incurred, and in some cases the importers going around in circles actually trying to find additional data which wasn't available to him in the first instance. Rule 5, very interestingly, actually says that if the importer relinquishes his claim, then actually the goods can be released immediately, and of course the claim of preferential duty will be disallowed. There is also a sort of straight up move away from the FTA benefit if there's sufficient evidence that the goods didn't meet origin criteria in the first place. So really Rule 5, as I said, is the first instance going to the importer and asking him. Now, this is that part which is not specifically mentioned in the SIPA. In the SIPA, when they were talking about verification, they were talking, as I said, reaching out to the authority in the exporting country. This is the stage before which is enabled in Karuta, where customs will first reach the Indian importer. He's the one taking all of this onus. And then what you see in verification, the verification request provisions under Rule 6 is actually more closely mirroring the conditions that you saw in the SIPA, which is to say that the Indian authority will reach out to the verification authority in the exporting country. If that information comes through and it satisfies, it's fine. If it doesn't, the level of investigation can be escalated by either asking for more information or, like I said, in the case of the UAE, going so far as to actually visiting the exporting country. Now, importantly, the verification request has, rather where there is a verification request situation, Karuta also provides for provisional clearance of the goods. So unlike in situation of Rule 5, where the goods are blocked when customs is interacting with the importer, when customs has gone to the next stage of interacting with the customs authority or the trade authority in the exporting country, provisional clearance of the goods has been enabled. And then, of course, if the final answer that comes through is that the goods don't meet the criterion, then they will be disallowed. Going one step further, in a situation where there's a Rule 6 disallowance, Karuta also allows all goods exported by that exporter to be disallowed even to other importers. So importer A might have been the one who was originally investigated and the Rule 6 investigation ultimately went against. That would then apply to other importers as well. That's what Karuta provides. And preferential treatment in such situations will only be restored if the exporter can prove the satisfaction of the SIPA conditions or the origin conditions. So what you therefore see is this situation where you need much closer communication, which may or may not be possible in all cases, but between the exporter and the importer to actually make these enablements which the treaties provide come through. And I think this is my last slide, the last provisions of Rule 8 of Karuta, which says that if an importer fails to provide information, then of course he can be proceeded against under the other sections under the Customs Act. And the last point which I mentioned, that the rules of origin prevail to the extent of conflict over the SIPA rules prevail over the provisions of Karuta. So I'll end it here and hand it over to Vikram to take you through some of the other elements, and then we'll, I think, have a few minutes at the end for questions. Thank you.
Very good evening to all. Thank you so much for having us here. Thank you, ASSOCHAM. When we contextualize FTAs and emerging FTAs and the proliferation of FTAs, obviously we want to look at this in the context of existing other aspects that affect trade per se. And chief among them, of course, is trade remedies. And when we speak about trade remedies here, of course, we mean anti-dumping, countervailing, subsidy, etc., and other bilateral issues which might come up, including non-tariff barriers, disputes. And what we would like to see, what are the emerging trends when it comes to trends and issues when it comes to trade remedies. So a couple of things that I'd like to lay out before you all, of course, is when it comes to anti-dumping and countervailing duties and trade remedies per se, the questionnaire formats that look at especially with the Indian authority, that look at participation from exporters, importers, etc. Those have been updated, especially the importer and the end user, which was clubbed together, now has an option of providing more elaborate data, making more elaborate comments on the situation, etc. So it's become definitely more participatory. One aspect that we always looked at was evergreening, where duties would continue in a sunset review, etc. We have now seen a more recently definitely seen a trend where duties are not automatically or elaborately just continued, but there is a very detailed examination. The central government has taken a stand in many cases where duties have not been continued further. Two new concepts came up. Were not so much new, but at least statutorily and regulatory, they've been incorporated as separate points of distinction that came up through budgetary amendments in the recent past. A, absorption, where duties appear to have been absorbed into the price. So a specific review mechanism was brought in through amendments to the Custom Tariff Act and the rules. You will see a questionnaire coming up soon, of course, and circumvention. And this becomes very evident in the context of FTAs, as I'd like to elaborate in my further slides. A large context was public interest, of course. We do know that the WTO under the anti-dumping agreement or the subsidies agreement does not require does not have a requirement of analysis of public interest. The safeguard agreement definitely does, because the safeguard is set up in a different context, a different requirement. It's not fault-based per se. It's more for infant industry, for being able to cope with the surge in imports, whereas an anti-dumping and an anti-subsidy is where the imports are dumped or subsidized and therefore cause material injury, whereas the requirement of injury in safeguard is that of a serious injury. The parameters may be the same, but the context of what injury is required is different. The questionnaire is under discussion. There have been meetings with the authority, of course, where a viable and feasible consideration of public interest can be made before the authority, because the authority goes into the question of public interest, but it's a very haphazard and random way of examining it. Data should be presented properly, and I think the authority is making a step in that direction. Try to set up a objective criterion whereby public interest will be examined both in the AD and the CBD, and as well as the safeguard context of it. Some trends that we've seen these days are PCN. PCN actually just stands for product control number methodology, or what the US calls as column variations. You see, for example, steel or even sometimes chemicals or other yarn, etc., come in different variations or grades. And to ensure an apple-to-apple comparison is made, now data is being collected through the updated questionnaires, and a specific step is being taken whereby the detailed discussions on the methodology for comparison come into play already. Please understand, these could be, and especially with what we are seeing with how tariffs are being amended. So every time you have a CTSH or a custom tariff subheading level difference where an FTA rate might be different, might be aligned, you are now seeing maybe a product variation type comparison, which is more not looking at just apples to apples, but we're looking at a crab apple to a crab apple, a Himalayan apple to a Himalayan apple, kind of a comparison coming into the DGTR's examination as well. Quantum, of course, or this practice was widely appreciated in most other jurisdictions as well. Now that it is translating throughout the course of all discussions, I think a good, a more new development. One thing that we have seen in the last few years are FTA specific safeguards. This a special safeguard is what I'll speak about further, but the trend that we have seen that not just domestic users which were affected by imports having increased under or owing to that product being included in an FTA, were generally left to examine dumping or safeguard on a global level or see whether those are dumped. Whereas sometimes the answer purely was that there has been a decline in the customs duty rate and hence imports have increased. Starting from, I think, the ASEAN, Korea, Japan, and now even in the UAE safeguard, that the text that we have before us, a special safeguard provision has been incorporated and continued. Of course, for the UAE, since the rules are yet to be announced and notified, I'm sure similar provisions can be done. But as an example, there was an investigation of a special safeguard on imports of phthalic anhydride from Korea, which has run its entire course and specifically targeting imports, this product, which were attributed to have increased due to the decline in the tariff rate. So that, I think, is a very interesting and novel way of looking at how FTAs and trade remedies actually correlate with each other. And of course, subsidies and countervailing duty, anti-subsidy or countervailing duty investigations itself, that the number of those investigations has also gone up as an emerging trend. And we do know it's a fact that India is one of the largest users of anti-dumping duty, but when it came to subsidies and countervailing duty measures, for some reason we were not. But I think in that trend is also changing. So when you come to businesses that are looking at bilateral trading partners, etc., one more important aspect is also keep in mind the anti-subsidy element or the countervailing duty arrangement that is happening vis-a-vis you and your exports, as well as imports that you make, because ultimately it's always the importer that bears the burden of the duty. With that background, I want to focus on some specific aspects of FTAs from a trade remedy lens. It's obvious, and it's a well-known fact that FTAs actually stimulate trade per se on account of lowering of the tariff on the product lines, especially where there is an immediate impact or even a phased impact. You do always see an increase in imports, and the increase in imports per se is actually a very common symptom for triggering any kind of trade remedy. If you go to safeguards, it is a surge in imports. If you look at countervailing duty, it will be an increase in imports which lead to material injury. Same with the anti-dumping duty, of course. So essentially, when we look at FTAs, there is a very high potential for anti-dumping, countervailing, or safeguard investigations also to increase with the operationalization of the FTA. Now that itself affects both the domestic users, domestic industry, the manufacturer of the product lines where imports have increased also have to keep this in mind, and also the importers, whereas the exporters also, which are entering into these relations with utilizing these relations, the FTA tariff lines with their bilateral trading partners. And that as a symptom means that we must keep in mind and be looking at our entire supply chain in the context of a likelihood or very high potential of trade remedial action when we look at it through that lens. Interestingly, as Udayan touched upon this, SIPA FTAs itself have mutated beyond just agreed tariff line kind of arrangement. They have gone on to include a vast majority of vast criterion that actually affect trade. You now have FTAs that cover or have arrangements on digital trade, on investment, on services, on SPS and TBT measures. And with every FTA that we see, the scope is increasing, where at least some actual benefit of bargain has been reached or an understanding has been reached on how parties should proceed on it. For example, trade remedies. Almost every free trade agreement that India now has, and this is reinforced in the India UAE SIPA as well, has a section on trade remedies per se. And I've just highlighted this on the trade remedies aspect. So where under the India UAE SIPA, where an anti-dumping duty or a countervailing duty investigation in respect of goods from the other party is terminated with a negative final determination or pursuant to a review. It basically means if there was an investigation and an exporter, let's say, or a country had nil duty and no duties were effectively continued, or there was a review conducted and that review turned into a negative determination, then for a period of 1 year after that termination, no new investigation will be initiated. Of course, the caveat is that the investigation must only be against that subject country. But here is a provision where the FTA is providing a right to that exporter on trade remedy that for a year no new fresh investigation will be initiated, which is a very important development to look at. Therefore, participating in an anti-dumping investigation, trying to attain that negative margin, it obviously helps you not with vis-a-vis just that investigation, but also recalibration of a new investigation against you. So when we look at trade remedies from that lens, definitely newer rights are coming into play, newer situations are coming into play when it comes to vis-a-vis the FTA that we are looking at. One more thing that I want to talk about in regard of the special safeguard provisions itself, something that I briefly spoke about as an emerging trend. See, in case of a surge in imports that arises out of the reduction or elimination of measures, of customs measures per se, a specific right is now being seen in most SIPAs, in most FTAs that India has, and has been seen in the India UAE CPA that I'm just trying to bring to your attention as a case study. That you can, as a domestic player, you can bring out a case for imposition of a safeguard measure. Now, this is a very different measure than the actual global safeguard measure. The global safeguard measure operates on the same principles, though, that there is an increase in imports globally into the importing country and the domestic industry is facing injury because of it, serious injury. The effect actually in a global safeguard is that duty is imposed for a period of time. But in a special safeguard under an FTA, and operational rules are notified by the authority and the DGTR examines this through a petition. This is already existing through separate rules for the India ASEAN FTA, the India Japan FTA, India Korea FTA. Point in case is the investigation of phthalic anhydride from Korea that I spoke about. But if we look at what the text of the India UAE CPA is, if as a result of reduction or elimination of the customs duty, an originating good is being imported in such increased quantities in absolute or relative terms, relative to the domestic production, of course, and it causes or threatens to cause serious injury, then you can bring in a case of a special safeguard where that reduction is suspended. So instead of getting the preferential rate, which would have been 0 or 2 or 3, you go back to the MFN rate. But you are so the provision that you had now is no longer in place. It is suspended for that period of time till the domestic industry comes back into place. This is also important for exporters to look at, to participate in these investigations, to oppose if necessary, or at least provide credible data saying that no such factor exists, and be mindful of what prices you are selling at, what prices are coming into the market, so that whenever you are looking at an investigation like this, at least the data provisions are in place. One more thing that we'd like to bring about in the context of FTAs. When we look at this through the lens of trade remedy specifically, one aspect that comes about, of course, is circumvention. Now, circumvention is a very specific aspect of the anti-dumping duty rules or trade remedies per se. But this generally happens when anti-dumping duties are levied on a product and then the exporters adopt practices whereby that duty is circumvented. When we look at Rule 25, circumvention through Rule 20 through the lens of 25, it is essentially a change in pattern of trade between any country or India or between an individual exporter as well, which as a result of the practice, process, or work for which there is insufficient cause or economic justification other than the imposition of duty, and of course there is injury and there is dumping, then the measure of anti-dumping or the anti-dumping duties that were extended to the earlier product are now extended to this new circumvented product as well. And what essentially happens, or how we look at it, is that what is this practice, process, or work? So with respect to that article that is subjected to anti-dumping duty, where it is imported in an unassembled, unfinished form and is assembled, finished, or finally produced in any other country, then such assembly, finishing, or completion could be considered as circumvention if the operation has started or increased just after or just prior to the anti-dumping investigation. And please note that there is a value addition requirement also that you need. Where it is any process involving any alteration, description, or name or composition of the article, where it is even in minor forms, regardless of the various variation per se of tariff classification, that could also be considered as circumvention. Where it is imported through any exporter or producer, which is not subject to the earlier anti-dumping duty, and there is a change in practice from the earlier exporter who was subject to it, then the pattern of trade or channels of sale are common, then you can look at that also to be deemed as circumvention. And of course, there is a catch-all under the rules where any other manner whereby the anti-dumping duty is rendered ineffective could also be considered as the practice, process, of work which would lead to circumvention, and those products which are coming through these practice, process, or works could also be levied with the same trade remedial motion. The reason I would like to highlight this per se is that at one end we have the FTA reducing the customs tariff on these goods. They may or may not be subject to anti-dumping duty, but where these goods are subjected to, let's say, an ADD, which is a significant factor on your entire supply chain that brings in the product, the exporter must keep in mind to have adequate justifications for and cause for bringing in the change in pattern as such. It cannot be that you do not have any economic justification or sufficient cause. You must ensure that these exports are actually technically not dumped, and every aspect of the shift in operations and fulfillment of the 35% value addition should be done. Now, when it comes to the context of, let's say, the UAE SIPA, it might be not that much of an issue because most of them are at 40% value addition. But there are cases where it's maybe 5% with a changing CTH, or 6%, maybe there's a melting pot condition. So there must be a harmonious reading of both the FTA and the anti-dumping duty, because otherwise you might be in a situation where yes, you are getting the benefit of the customs duty reduction, but you're levied with an AD duty that you did not sign up for. Hence, specific regard must be had when you're looking at bringing in ADD levied products or trade remedy levied products from an FTA partner. And overall, also, what we'd like to just bring up onto your attention is the importance of monitoring for dumping and how that really leads in to having a more sustainable supply chain channel. Lowering of tariff, yes, generally does lead to an increase in imports, and that might be considered as dumped. If not for the special safeguard, there might be an indication that this looks like it is dumped or it might be causing an injury. So supply chains must keep a constant monitor and calibrate their exports in a manner that they are not looking like they are technically dumped or they are not dumped. It's an exercise that they must do in successive periodic reviews, internally at least. Same applies to any exporter. It need not be an exporter into India. An exporter out of India also has the same obligations, of course. From domestic industry or even users that are bringing in products using the benefit of these FTAs, a monitoring mechanism must be considered to check against any inadvertent dumping or that kind of a situation that ultimately would lead to being caught in the same process of this anti-dumping duty investigation, and then that levy is there for 5 years. So therefore, whatever remedial or whatever positive benefits that you have of an FTA, generally, they become countered to that extent at least. And dumping investigations have wide and very lasting effects. So monitoring actually acts as a very effective tool, and not just for the exporter into India, but also for an exporter out of India, to constantly review and monitor, mitigate against any untoward events into a very important market, which could be something like the US, could be or any other market where you already have some presence or want to build a presence. So that essentially when we look at some aspects of trade remedies from the lens of an FTA or an FTA from the lens of trade remedies, these are some things that we must be very, very mindful of as exporters, and they do impact trade in general. Something that has now proliferated because of the manner in which FTAs or the reach of FTAs has increased are non-tariff barriers, or what we call non-tariff barriers are any specific requirement or any specific condition or regulatory requirement that is not a tariff related measure per se. It's a very loose definition, but generally they include SPS and TBT measures such as mandatory standards, compulsory conditions, any other non-tariff related obligations where it's essentially mandatory compliance. NTBs in India generally get regulated through various tools, quality controls, for example, steel, chemicals, which are generally a lot, mandatory BIS certification or standards, for example, the IS standards for mobile phones, FSI standards, milk products, nutraceuticals, hazardous and e-waste regulations. So there's a whole gamut of these regulations that apply to effectively put in place a non-tariff barrier. NTBs are essentially border measures, so unless the exporter or you yourself as an exporter are actually participating into the process of that regulatory body, you are out of the market because you don't comply with the standard. So to navigate this, what we are seeing now is to look at how the FTA harmonizes or aligns this requirement in terms of, yes, they undertake the SPS and TBT, for example, in an SPS or a TBT situation, or technical barriers to trade as they are called. The UAE SIPA says that we will agree and abide by the or adhere to the WTO standards, and there might be transparency requirements or some form of equivalence or recognition that might come about, which essentially facilitates the manner in which the TBT is eased or the standard is eased and trade is facilitated. Most of the FTAs that we now see have specific chapters dedicated to the assessment of SPS and TBT measures or any other non-tariff measures. Like Udayan said, no non-tariff measure, at least in the India UAE SIPA that we see, no non-tariff measure can be taken which is contrary to the UAE SIPA or the WTO. So you have an additional level of protection that FTAs are providing you against any kind of arbitrary action. And vigilance by exporters to the FTA partners and countries, essentially these partners can also look at and assess the WTO compatibility, which can help really smooth out issues that can be there. And not just the WTO, the India UAE SIPA itself also has a very interesting position on dispute settlement. So where there is a bilateral issue, most of the FTAs are now also allowing you to raise a dispute settlement mechanism on a bilateral level itself, which can be more easily accessed, condition depending on the volume of trade, etc., to come to some form of resolution over. With that, I think I'd like to summarize. I'd like to just complete my discussion per se, and we'd like to, then we'd like to keep at least 15 minutes open to the floor for your questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vikram Nayak and Mr. Udayan Choksi. Now the floor is open for the question answers. There are a few question answers in the Q&A box, as well as a couple of questions were there in the chat box, which I have just sent you in your chat box. So if you would like to revert to them.
Yeah, we're just pulling up the questions. Just give us a moment, please.
Yeah.
What the first question?
That's just a comment.
Oh. We have a question on, I think, the Ukraine war sanctions that we are looking at.
You want to take that? It says, let me read the question. It says, my question is that during the Ukraine war, sanctions on Russia are imposed on Russian trade and services by NATO nations, but Germany imported the oil in
51% blended oil.
Okay. As
citing country of origin factor, please. So I'm not following. Is that maybe that because of the origin criterion, it could be blocked or sanctioned per se? I think that's the question.
Kindly answer how FTA country of origin rationale plays out among geopolitical geosphere. That's the question. So, well, I think that there's two different parts to it. I don't know if we've got the question completely from what we're seeing on the screen. But I think, let me put it this way. I think I would contextualize all of these FTAs, RTAs, SIPAs in a context of cooperating countries. Europe, of course, was the next level of treaty in the context of the different types of treaties that I mentioned to you. The ultimate sort of situation of collaborating countries is a customs union, which Europe is. So, as I said, all of these treaties work in a context of cooperating countries. Here, when you're dealing with a situation where sort of there is a sanction, and I think the question is, can the SIPAs or can these measures be used to circumvent any of the sanctions? I think that the simple answer to that would be no. And even if you take India, and people have been asking these questions even in India context in terms of, for example, the rupee-ruble trade, of course, that's not under a treaty, but how that's enabled and how that sort of fits into the larger scheme of things. And the answer to that is that that is something which has been bilaterally negotiated. The fact that the US has imposed sanctions or threatened to impose sanctions even on those who cooperate with Russia, ultimately would be another bilateral measure if something were to come through, bilateral or plurilateral measure that would come through there. But of itself, none of these sort of enabling treaties will directly circumvent any sanctions, because all of those sanctions operate outside of the WTO context. Vikram, do you want to,
yes,
your US example?
Yes, of course. Let me just to add into everything that Udayan said. Please understand that the FTA and the country of origin benefit that you get under an FTA is not against the WTO standard. Article 24 particularly allows you to have an MFN plus requirement. That's why even when that position is suspended, you go back to the MFN requirement, which is what the WTO obligation is. If a sanction operates in a manner that is WTO violative, then the country which is affected by such a sanction measure can obviously bring in a dispute before the WTO. What we do get through a FTA, which is what Udayan clarified, is that you get to bring down conditions of trade and facilitate trade per se, and barriers to trade between trading partners under Article 24 to have a larger duty-free trade between them, which is what Article 24 applies. But if you take sanctions which are actually WTO inconsistent, then per se the country that is affected by these sanctions may bring in a dispute where this is against the WTO standard itself. If that answers the question.
Thanks. I think there's another question talking about classification in the context of Australia and saying that there's a difference between the Australian customs tariff and the Indian tariff, and therefore there's a difference in terms of how the two countries are classifying a certain Chapter 27 product, and therefore how will that work out? I think the answer there is that one has to look at therefore the HSN. Now, two points there. One is in terms of course, in the numbers that you've shared here, up to chapter and heading level, the entry is the same. So one really needs to see how the treaty, once the text becomes available, how the treaty actually talks about that distinction. But ultimately, the HSN would be the common factor. And I would believe if we're talking about imports into India, then so long as the Indian customs tariff, which is, as we know, aligned to the HSN, qualifies under that criterion, there shouldn't be a problem, even if the Australia entry is different. There's another question about how a trading company in the UAE can take benefit of the trade policy. Now, the answer is that actually it's for not really for trading companies in the purest sense. It's for manufacturing companies, which is why we talked about manufacture, production, produce. Having said which, you remember I touched briefly upon an article after we talked about transportation, about third-party invoicing. And really, third-party invoicing would be that situation where you have a trading company, like a merchant exporter, who is involving himself in the overall supply chain. What that requires is that the trading company connect itself into the supply chain. It needs to know who the importer and it needs to know all of the details on the manufacturing side before the export takes place. And so long as that connectivity is established between the trader and the exporter, the FTA will then enable that benefit to also come through even when there's a trader in between. But all it needs is that there must be that close connection between manufacturer and trader for that necessary information to pass through to the trader. Of course, what this does is it increases the onus on the Indian importer, because he then potentially is one degree of separation removed from the exporter, who's ultimately responsible for the obligations that he's signing up for. But that's the only way the trading company can take benefit. It's not direct, it will have to piggyback.
There's a question for Mr. Surendra Kumar Kalla, like what is the position of ADR in UAE SIPA?
I'm sorry, what's the position on?
Of ADR in UAE SIPA.
ADR as in
do you mean
alternative dispute resolution?
Right.
You want to?
So as far as the SIPA is concerned, there is a conciliation process that is looked at, but that is for bilateral disputes or issues that are taken up between the two governments. So you can obviously, if you see a trade dispute emerging, for example, potentially if the treatment given to products is, let's say, not in consonance with what is broadly agreed, then yes, there is a conciliation process that can be followed, after which a panel will be set up. So you don't have to run to the WTO dispute settlement body, which we know, and we know what the condition there today is. There's no appellate body that is functioning, but a dispute resolution mechanism does exist on a government to government level under the SIPA itself, and it does include an ADR mechanism there. It does have a consultation process, and thereafter it goes into a panel related dispute settlement kind of an issue. I just wanted to come back to the Australia point as well. Yes, this is quite common. We do see this not only as a problem or litigation prone issue that might come up in the India-Australia SIPA as soon as we see the text. But yes, this does happen with existing FTAs also. Sometimes your CO that is issued by the issuing country says one HS code, and the importer, because of the practice in India, has a different HS code. That is also litigation prone. So all of these issues really need to be looked at with a very fine lens, to see whether is it a border issue, is it a government level issue, and how well that issue can be handled and resolved. But the point is, we must be mindful, because you don't want to be caught saying that your CO is not matching and requires you to go into a verification process, and some untoward action is taken against you. So therefore, continuous monitoring and ensuring that the benefit translates down to the last level is absolutely essential.
There's another, I think this is a follow-on question to the Australia piece, which is what's the process of applying the export products under the product-specific rules? Now, it's not product-specific rules. So like I said, the way I would approach it is to say that under the HSN, the way the HSN classifies the goods in question, you need to sort of dovetail that classification into the context of the FTA and apply under that to the relevant exporting country. So this is exactly where this issue of at which digit level the qualification, disqualification is going to happen becomes important. This is that whole issue about, getting involved in the negotiation of the at the right time comes into play. There's another question on, is there any news on the India-South Africa Customs Union Preferential Trade Agreement? I think that's lost a little bit of steam from what I gather. I haven't read about it or heard about it recently. Like I said, the focus for now seems to be Europe, EU and the UK. But I don't know. Have you read?
Not that we've come across something that says SACO is the immediate priority, but again, going back to what Udayan's point was, the idea of if there is a point to be taken on the SACO or any other 2B or FTA that is in process, such as the UK BIT, the UK one that is in play, or the EU one that is in discussion, or the GCC one that is expected soon. Now is the time to make sure that your representations are considered. To make sure that the FTA product that you see at the end of the day aligns with your interests per se. So it's never too late to take up this issue with the government. They're very open. They're very considerate of your representation. You never know, and if there is a specific issue that you want to have consideration, it's never too early to bring it up with the trade policy division.
And also that, like I said, this looking out approach, I think, is something what Indian businesses are doing more. So it's not about which goods will come in cheaper under a lower customs duty rate, but really, how can Indian exporters benefit from this access and lower duties in the destination countries. I think there's one more question. There's a manufacturer of petroleum products where the input base oil falls under 2710/1970 and finished goods are exported under again 2710/1989. The claim the benefit on a conditional change in 6 digits is a must. How to satisfy this where 6 digits remains the same? Whether we should approach
So is this if this is the India UAE FTA specifically, or is there a?
It doesn't say, but
It doesn't say. So if it is,
yeah, sorry. Well, so how to satisfy it? It really is a question of what's in the treaty, and again, this goes back to the point of negotiation. If the negotiation says that the CTC change has to be at the 6-digit level, then that's something which needs to be negotiated at the right point of time. Or if that time is gone, then when opportunity presents itself to relook at it. But otherwise, there's no how should I say? There's no way to get around this as a requirement, because at the PSR, as we said, there's one value addition criterion, and then the second criterion could be, or in most cases, is about some change in the classification.
absolutely. And coming to approaching the WTO, like I clarified, this is a bilateral commitment between two entities, two trading countries on what beneficial tariff can be provided. Therefore, going to the WTO may not be an option, but yes, the dispute mechanism that exists if the two governments decide to take it up, or maybe there might be a different resolution to an amendment or something like that could be considered if the issue is severe and strong enough. But that essentially starts from representation to your own government to take this up methodically.
So I don't think there's any other questions. So now that brings us to the end of this very informative session. And we would like to convey our sincere thanks to Khitan and Company for partnering us at this important webinar. And I would like to convey my sincere thanks to Mr. Choksi and Mr. Nayak for sharing their important views with all of us. I would like to thank all the participants for attending this session, and we shall be sharing the PPT with you over your email ID. We look forward to have you with us in our next session. Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you, Avinash. Thank you, everyone.